When the blade of a French executioner's sword severs a human neck with surgical precision, death comes swiftly. The brain, severed from its blood supply, loses consciousness within seconds. But on the morning of May 19th, 1536, as Anne Boleyn knelt on the scaffold at Tower Green, the true horror wasn't the physical act awaiting her. It was the methodical, calculated destruction of a woman who had once been the most desired queen in Europe, reduced to a convicted adulteress and traitor through what history would recognize as one of the most sophisticated character assassinations ever orchestrated by the English crown. Anne Boleyn, mother of the future Elizabeth I, the woman for whom Henry VIII had defied the Pope and fractured England's relationship with Rome, would die not by the traditional executioner's axe, but by a specially summoned French swordsman. The king's final gesture of mercy to the woman he had once pursued with passionate desperation was ensuring her death would be swift and clean. Yet this small kindness only emphasized the grotesque theater of her destruction. Just 17 days earlier, Anne had been Queen of England, presiding over a court that revolved around her every word and gesture. She had survived the political minefield of Henry's great matter, his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and emerged victorious as his second wife, crowned in Westminster Abbey with all the pageantry the realm could muster. But by May 2nd, she found herself imprisoned in the very Tower of London where she had spent the night before her coronation just 3 years prior. The symbolism was as deliberate as it was cruel. The charges against her read like a catalogue of the most heinous crimes imaginable for a queen. Adultery with multiple men, including her own musical instructor Mark Smeaton and courtiers Sir Francis Weston and Sir William Brereton. But perhaps most shocking of all was the accusation of incestuous relations with her brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. These weren't merely accusations of personal moral failing, they struck at the very heart of Tudor legitimacy, suggesting that Princess Elizabeth might be a bastard and that Anne had conspired to imagine the king's death. Modern historians examining the timeline of events, the quality of evidence, and the political pressures surrounding Henry's court have reached a near-unanimous conclusion. Anne Boleyn was almost certainly innocent of all charges. What unfolded in those 17 days between her arrest and execution was not justice, but a masterclass in Tudor political theatre designed to remove an inconvenient queen and clear the path for Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour, who was already waiting in the wings. The machinery of Anne's destruction had been set in motion by forces far more powerful than personal vendetta. Henry's obsession with securing a male heir had reached fever pitch after Anne produced only a daughter and suffered subsequent miscarriages. The king's ardor had cooled dramatically, replaced by the familiar Tudor paranoia about succession and legitimacy. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's ruthless chief minister, recognized the political winds and began constructing a case that would satisfy the king's need for a new marriage while protecting the crown from accusations of mere fickleness. What makes Anne's fate particularly chilling is how thoroughly her enemies succeeded in rewriting her narrative. The woman who had once been celebrated for her intelligence, wit, and French sophistication became, through carefully orchestrated propaganda, a seductress whose alleged appetites knew no bounds. Chronicles from the period, many written after her death, painted her as everything from a witch with supernatural powers to seduce the king, to a woman so depraved she would commit incest for political gain. The trial itself was a foregone conclusion. 26 peers of the realm, including Anne's own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, sat in judgment over her. The evidence presented was largely circumstantial. Private meetings with male courtiers that could easily be explained by the normal functioning of a royal court, along with the coerced confession of Mark Smeaton, extracted under unknown circumstances that historians suspect involved torture. Yet what emerges most powerfully from the historical record is not the predetermined nature of Anne's conviction, but her extraordinary composure in facing it. Contemporary accounts describe a woman who maintained her dignity even as the full weight of Tudor propaganda machinery crushed her reputation. She spoke eloquently at her trial, defended her innocence with clarity and intelligence, and faced her approaching death with a courage that impressed even her enemies. The choice of execution by sword rather than axe was highly unusual for England, where beheading typically involved the heavy executioner's block and axe. Henry's decision to summon an expert swordsman from Calais, a man skilled in the French method of execution, represented both a final act of consideration for his former queen and a desire to conclude the sordid affair with efficiency. There would be no botched attempts, no struggling, no undignified spectacle. Anne's death, unlike her trial, would be swift and sure. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Anne Boleyn's execution lies in how completely it served Henry's immediate political needs while creating a legacy that would haunt the Tudor dynasty for generations. In destroying Anne, Henry didn't merely eliminate an inconvenient wife. He demonstrated that even queens were expendable when they failed to serve the crown's purposes. This terrifying precedent would shadow every subsequent royal marriage and contribute to the atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that characterized the later Tudor court. The woman who died that May morning was not the scheming adulteress of Tudor propaganda, but a queen whose greatest crime was failing to produce a male heir for an increasingly desperate and tyrannical king. In the opulent halls of Greenwich Palace, a young woman with dark hair and penetrating eyes moves through the corridors with a confidence that defies convention. She is not the most beautiful woman at court. Contemporary accounts make this clear, but there is something magnetic about Anne Boleyn that will soon upend the foundations of English society. Within a decade, this same woman will kneel on a scaffold at the Tower of London, her neck bared to a French executioner's blade. But in these early years of the 1520s, Anne Boleyn is ascending to heights of power that few women in English history would ever reach. Anne had returned from the sophisticated courts of the Netherlands and France with an education that set her apart from her English peers. She could speak French fluently, play musical instruments, and engage in the kind of intellectual discourse that the Renaissance court prized. Most importantly, she had absorbed the continental style of courtly romance, a dangerous skill in a court ruled by a king hungry for novelty and increasingly frustrated with his Spanish wife, Catherine of Aragon. When Anne joined Queen Catherine's household as a lady-in-waiting around 1522, she entered a world of careful political calculations. The queen she served was beloved by the English people but had failed in her primary duty as royal consort. She had not produced a living male heir. After multiple pregnancies and miscarriages, only one child survived, Princess Mary. For Henry VIII, this represented not just personal disappointment, but an existential threat to the Tudor dynasty he was meant to perpetuate. Initially, Henry's interest in the Boleyn family centered on Anne's sister Mary, who had become his mistress. But Anne possessed something more dangerous than conventional beauty or temporary sexual appeal. She understood power. When Henry's attention turned to her, Anne deployed a strategy so audacious that it would have seemed impossible to any previous generation of royal mistresses. She refused the king's advances. This was not the coy resistance expected in courtly romance, but a calculated political maneuver. Anne understood that Henry's desire for her would only intensify if she remained unattainable. More crucially, she grasped that her only path to lasting influence lay not through the royal bedchamber, but through the marriage altar. In a court where royal mistresses were used and discarded with predictable regularity, Anne Boleyn demanded nothing less than to become queen. The surviving letters between Henry and Anne during their courtship reveal the king's growing obsession. His correspondence grows increasingly desperate as Anne maintains her distance, writing from her family estate rather than remaining constantly available at court. "I beseech you to let me know expressly your whole mind as to the love between us two," Henry pleads in one letter. In another, he promises her that, "Henceforth my heart shall be dedicated to you alone." These were not the casual endearments of a king to his mistress, but the fervent declarations of a man whose desire had transformed into something approaching madness. By 1527, Henry had convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was cursed by God, punishment for having married his brother's widow, despite the papal dispensation that had originally sanctioned the union. This theological interpretation conveniently aligned with his political needs and his burning desire for Anne Boleyn. He petitioned Pope Clement VII for an annulment, expecting the same papal cooperation that had facilitated his first marriage. But Anne had miscalculated one crucial factor: international politics. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor who had recently sacked Rome and effectively held the Pope captive. Clement VII could not afford to anger Charles by annulling his aunt's marriage, regardless of Henry's theological arguments or political pressure. What followed was a religious and political revolution that Anne had neither anticipated nor desired. Faced with papal resistance, Henry chose to break with Rome entirely rather than abandon his pursuit of Anne. The Act of Supremacy would make Henry the head of the Church of England, while the annulment of his marriage to Catherine would be decided by English ecclesiastical courts under Henry's control. The human cost of this transformation was staggering. Sir Thomas More, the king's former chancellor and close friend, would face execution for refusing to acknowledge Henry's supremacy over the church. John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, would meet the same fate. Monasteries would be dissolved, their wealth feeding Henry's treasury while their inhabitants faced poverty or death. An entire religious and social order would be dismantled to clear the path for Anne Boleyn's marriage. On January 25, 1533, Henry and Anne were secretly married in a dawn ceremony. Anne was already pregnant, a calculated risk that had paid off with the promise of the male heir that Henry desperately needed. On September 7, 1533, Anne gave birth at Greenwich Palace, the same halls where she had first caught the king's attention. But the child was a girl, Elizabeth. The midwives and courtiers who had prepared celebrations for a prince found themselves announcing the birth of another princess. Henry's disappointment was palpable, though he attempted to maintain public composure. The jousts and tournaments planned for the birth of a male heir were quietly cancelled. Anne had achieved the impossible by becoming queen, but she had failed at the one task that justified her existence: producing the son who would secure the Tudor succession. In that moment of disappointed silence following Elizabeth's birth, the seeds of Anne Boleyn's destruction were already taking root. The woman who had manipulated a king, triggered a religious revolution, and crowned herself Queen of England had discovered the brutal truth about royal women. Their power lasted only as long as their ability to produce male heirs. By 1535, Anne Boleyn had discovered what thousands of women throughout history would learn: that a man's love can transform into something far more dangerous than hatred. Henry VIII, who had torn apart his kingdom's religious foundations to marry her, now watched her with the calculating eyes of a merchant evaluating a failed investment. The king, who had once written passionate letters declaring her the woman in the whole world that I value most, was now openly courting Jane Seymour while Anne's belly remained stubbornly flat. The arithmetic of royal marriage was brutal and precise. Catherine of Aragon had given Henry one surviving daughter. Anne had done the same. Elizabeth, born in September 1533 to Henry's barely concealed disappointment. The king had been so certain Anne would deliver a son that male names had been chosen, male courtiers notified, and announcements prepared celebrating the arrival of a prince. Instead, midwives handed him another daughter, and with her, the growing whisper that perhaps God was not blessing this union after all. Anne had suffered at least 2 miscarriages after Elizabeth's birth, losses that cut deeper than physical pain. In a court where pregnancy announcements were political events and menstrual cycles were monitored by spies, Anne's body had become a public failure. Each monthly cycle without conception was noted, discussed, and reported back to the king. The woman who had once wielded her sexuality like a weapon now found it turned against her with surgical precision. The miscarriage of early 1536 proved particularly devastating. Some chronicles suggest the lost child was male, a son finally, but born too early to draw breath. Others indicate Anne lost the pregnancy around the time of Catherine of Aragon's death in January, a timing that Henry's superstitious mind transformed into divine judgment. The king, who had once seen Anne's sharp intelligence as captivating, now viewed her quick tongue as evidence of a shrewish nature that perhaps had cursed their marriage bed. Jane Seymour represented everything Anne was not: pale where Anne was dark, quiet where Anne was witty, submissive where Anne was assertive. Henry's courtship of Jane followed a pattern that Anne knew intimately. She had once been the recipient of such attention. The king gifted Jane his portrait set in a locket, sent her purses of coins, and arranged for her to be given apartments in the royal palace. Anne, who had orchestrated similar maneuvers against Catherine, now found herself the discarded queen watching her replacement receive the same calculated seduction. But unlike Catherine, who had responded to rejection with dignified withdrawal, Anne fought back with the fierce intelligence that had first captivated Henry. She confronted him about his attentions to Jane, demanded explanations, and refused to accept her displacement gracefully. These scenes, once the passionate arguments of lovers, now struck Henry as evidence of an uncontrollable, possibly treasonous nature. The king began to remember Anne's flirtations differently, reinterpreting her courtly behavior as evidence of adultery, her wit as cunning, her independence as defiance. The transformation in how others treated Anne reflected Henry's cooling affections with courtly precision. Nobles who had once competed for her attention now barely acknowledged her presence. Her own household began reporting her conversations and visitors to the king's agents. Anne found herself increasingly isolated, surrounded by people whose loyalty had shifted with the political wind. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, watched these developments with the calculating mind of a man who understood that the king's problems had become his own to solve. Cromwell had orchestrated Anne's rise by managing the legal complexities of Henry's first annulment. Now he began to consider what methods might be required to orchestrate her fall. The king needed a solution that would free him to remarry quickly while avoiding the international scandal that had accompanied his first divorce. By early 1536, Anne must have sensed the closing trap. Her brother George reported that Henry had complained privately about being seduced by witchcraft into his second marriage, suggesting that the king was already constructing a narrative that would transform him from eager bridegroom into deceived victim. Anne's former allies began distancing themselves, and the evangelical reformers who had once seen her as their champion started seeking new protectors. The woman who had once controlled access to the king now found herself begging for audiences. Henry, who had written over a dozen passionate letters during their courtship, now communicated through intermediaries. Anne's chambers, once the center of court life, became a place courtiers visited only when protocol demanded. The isolation must have been suffocating, to go from being the most powerful woman in England to a barely tolerated presence in her own palace. In these final months before her arrest, Anne Boleyn learned that queens could be unmade as systematically as they were created. Every tool that had elevated her, her sexuality, her intelligence, her political connections, was being recalibrated as evidence of her unfitness to rule. Henry wasn't just preparing to divorce her, he was constructing a case that would justify erasing her entirely. The king who had once moved heaven and earth to marry her was now preparing to move them again to destroy her. May 2nd, 1536. Greenwich Palace. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, sits in her private chambers when the heavy oak doors burst open. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, strides in, flanked by guards. There is no warning, no explanation, just the cold formality of arrest. Within minutes, the woman who had transformed England's entire religious landscape to secure her marriage to the king finds herself accused of adultery, incest, and high treason. The charges are so severe that conviction means death. But perhaps most chilling of all, Anne's reaction suggests this moment didn't come as a complete surprise. The arrest itself was swift, almost clinical in its efficiency. Cromwell read the charges with bureaucratic precision while Anne listened in what witnesses described as stunned silence. adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George, conspiracy against the king's life, treason against the crown she had fought so desperately to wear. The accusations were so explosive, so perfectly crafted to destroy not just Anne's life, but her very reputation, that they bear the hallmarks of a carefully orchestrated political assassination. What makes this moment particularly haunting is Anne's composure. According to the Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who despised Anne but proved reliable in his observations, she received the news with an almost eerie calm. This wasn't the reaction of an innocent woman blindsided by false accusations. This was the response of someone who had been watching the political winds shift for months, who had seen the king's attention transfer to Jane Seymour, who understood that her failure to produce a male heir had made her expendable. The journey from Greenwich to the Tower of London took place by barge along the Thames, the same waterway Anne had travelled in triumph just 3 years earlier for her coronation. But now the royal barge carried a prisoner. The irony would not have been lost on Anne. The Tower, which had once housed her in luxury before her wedding, would now become her final prison. The same chambers that had witnessed her preparation for queenship would witness her preparation for death. Upon arrival at the Tower, Anne was placed in the same apartments she had occupied before her coronation. This wasn't coincidence, it was psychological warfare. Every tapestry, every piece of furniture, every window view would remind her of what she had been and what she had lost. The king's men understood that physical imprisonment was only one form of torment. The crushing weight of fallen grandeur served as its own form of torture. What followed were days of careful isolation designed to break Anne's spirit and extract confessions. She was attended by women specifically chosen for their loyalty to the king: Lady Kingston, wife of the Tower's constable, and Lady Boleyn, Anne's own aunt, who had been turned against her. These weren't companions. They were watchers, instructed to report every word Anne spoke, every emotion she displayed, every sign of weakness that might be exploited. The psychological pressure was relentless. Anne was cut off from all news of her brother George, who had been arrested the same day. She had no word of her friends and alleged lovers, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and Mark Smeaton, who were already being tortured in other parts of the Tower. The silence was designed to feed paranoia and despair. Who had confessed? Who had implicated her? What evidence had they manufactured? Perhaps most cruelly, Anne was given no access to proper legal counsel. In Tudor England, those accused of treason were denied the right to effective defense. They could not call favorable witnesses, could not examine evidence against them, and could not prepare meaningful responses to charges. The legal system had been weaponized against her with surgical precision. The Tower itself became a character in Anne's torment. Its ancient walls had witnessed the executions of countless prisoners, and that history pressed down on every inhabitant. At night, Anne would have heard the sounds of other prisoners, the rattling of chains, distant cries, the heavy footsteps of guards. During the day, she could see from her windows the very scaffold where her life would likely end. But what truly distinguished Anne's imprisonment was its publicity. Unlike common criminals, her arrest and confinement became immediate news across Europe. Ambassadors sent detailed dispatches to their home courts. Merchants carried gossip along trade routes. The woman who had once been the most celebrated queen in Europe was now the most infamous prisoner. Her shame was as international as her former glory had been. The speed of events revealed just how thoroughly planned her destruction had been. Within days of her arrest, evidence was being gathered, witnesses were being questioned, and preparations for a trial were underway. This wasn't an investigation seeking truth. It was a predetermined conclusion, working backward to find justification. In her Tower cell, Anne began to display the first cracks in her composure. Lady Kingston reported that the Queen alternated between moments of almost manic confidence, declaring her innocence and expecting vindication, and periods of deep despair when she seemed to grasp the hopelessness of her situation. She spoke obsessively about her daughter Elizabeth, wondering what would become of the child when her mother was gone. The imprisonment had achieved its purpose. By the time Anne's trial approached, she had been systematically isolated, psychologically undermined, and legally neutered. The woman who entered the Tower as England's queen would emerge only to face a tribunal designed not to determine her guilt, but to formalize her destruction. On the morning of May 15th, 1536, Anne Boleyn was brought before 26 peers of the realm in the Great Hall of the Tower of London. The woman who had once commanded the reverence of these same men now stood as their prisoner, accused of crimes that could see her head severed from her shoulders. What unfolded over the next few hours would demonstrate how easily the machinery of English justice could be corrupted when a king desired a different outcome. The evidence presented against the Queen of England was so flimsy, so obviously fabricated, that even her contemporaries recognized the trial for what it truly was, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to legitimize murder. The charges against Anne were breathtaking in their scope and calculated cruelty. Adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. Plotting the king's death through poison and witchcraft. Treason against the crown she had helped elevate to unprecedented power. Each accusation was more damning than the last, each designed to paint her not merely as an unfaithful wife, but as a monster who had violated every sacred bond of marriage, family, and loyalty to the realm. But when the prosecutors began presenting their evidence, the weakness of their case became immediately apparent to anyone paying attention. The alleged adultery with court musician Mark Smeaton was based entirely on a confession extracted under torture, a confession Smeaton had already attempted to retract. The accusations involving courtiers Henry Norris and William Brereton relied on witness testimony from servants and rivals, people whose own positions depended on royal favor and who had every incentive to say whatever their interrogators wanted to hear. Most grotesque of all was the charge of incest with her brother George. The evidence? A conversation between siblings, witnessed by a lady-in-waiting that was deemed too intimate for a brother and sister. Words spoken in private, interpreted by hostile observers, transformed into proof of unspeakable sin. No witness claimed to have seen any physical intimacy. No evidence of secret meetings or furtive exchanges was presented. The entire case rested on the revolutionary legal theory that a private conversation between family members could constitute a capital crime. The men sitting in judgment of Anne Boleyn included several who owed their positions to her influence, others who had openly opposed her rise to power, and most tellingly, her own uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. Norfolk, calculating the political winds with the cold precision of a career survivor, had already determined that his niece's life was a price worth paying for his own continued favor with the king. He would preside over proceedings that bore all the hallmarks of justice but none of its substance. Anne was not permitted legal counsel, as was standard practice in treason trials of the era. She was expected to answer charges that carried a mandatory death sentence while navigating legal complexities that would challenge even experienced lawyers. Yet, witnesses who observed her during the trial noted her composure and the intelligence of her responses. When pressed about her alleged conversations with the king's supposed rivals, she acknowledged normal court interactions while firmly denying any impropriety. When confronted with the accusations of plotting Henry's death, she pointed out the obvious, that she had more to gain from his continued life and favor than any other person in England. The most damning evidence against the trial's legitimacy lay not in what was presented, but in what was conveniently absent. None of the alleged lovers, torture-extracted confession aside, had confessed to intimate relations with the Queen. No letters, gifts, or tokens had been discovered. No pregnancies had been concealed or terminated. For a woman supposedly conducting multiple simultaneous affairs over several years, including with her own brother, Anne Boleyn had left remarkably little evidence of her alleged crimes. More telling still was the timeline presented by the prosecution. Several of the alleged acts of adultery were said to have occurred when court records clearly showed Anne was either in different locations entirely or in the advanced stages of pregnancy. The prosecutors seemed to believe that their word alone was sufficient to overcome the inconvenience of documented royal itineraries and the basic facts of human biology. The speed of the proceedings revealed their predetermined nature. Complex charges that should have required weeks to investigate thoroughly were presented, argued, and decided in a matter of hours. No time was allocated for gathering additional evidence or allowing the accused to mount a meaningful defense. The verdict, guilty on all charges, surprised no one present because everyone understood they were witnessing political theatre, not legal proceedings. As the Earl of Northumberland read the sentence of death, Anne Boleyn maintained the dignified composure that had characterized her throughout the proceedings. She was condemned to be burned alive or beheaded at the king's pleasure. The casual nature of this final detail, death by fire or sword depending on royal whim, revealed the arbitrary cruelty at the heart of the entire process. What made Anne's trial particularly chilling was not its outcome, which had been determined before the first witness testified, but its veneer of legitimacy. Every legal form was observed, every procedural requirement met. The records would show that Anne Boleyn received a trial before her peers and was found guilty of the charges against her. Future historians would have to look beyond the official documents to understand that they were reading the carefully constructed fiction of a king who needed legal justification for murder. The machinery of English justice had been perverted to serve the personal desires of a man who possessed the power to rewrite law itself, transforming judicial proceedings into an elaborate method of character assassination that would culminate in the systematic destruction of a human being. The morning of May 19th, 1536 dawned clear and crisp at the Tower of London. Within the fortress walls, preparations for an execution unlike any other in English history were underway. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England for just 3 years, would become the first English queen to be publicly beheaded. But Henry VIII had made an extraordinary decision. Instead of the traditional executioner's axe, Anne would die by the sword of a master swordsman specially summoned from France. This singular act of apparent mercy would, in mere seconds, sever not just a neck, but an entire dynasty's hopes and a king's former obsessions. Henry's choice of execution method spoke to the complex psychology of a man destroying what he had once desperately desired. The skilled French executioner had been secretly commissioned days before Anne's trial even concluded, revealing the predetermined nature of her fate. This professional killer wielded a weapon designed for precision, a sharp, lightweight sword that could deliver death in a single, swift stroke. Unlike the heavy English axe that required multiple blows and often resulted in agonizing, botched executions, the French technique promised instantaneous death. The brain stem would be severed immediately, causing instant unconsciousness and rapid brain death through catastrophic blood loss. Yet this mercy came wrapped in its own cruelty. Anne had spent her final night praying, believing until the last moment that Henry might spare her life. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she had slept fitfully, waking before dawn to request communion. She dressed carefully in a grey damask gown with a low neckline, a deliberate choice that would allow the sword to find its mark cleanly. Over this, she wore an ermine mantle, the white fur symbolizing the purity she maintained despite the accusations of adultery and incest that had condemned her. As the scaffold was prepared on Tower Green, a small, intimate space chosen to limit witnesses to a select group of officials and nobles, Anne displayed a composure that unnerved even her captors. The constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, later wrote that her calmness seemed almost supernatural. She inquired repeatedly about the swordsman's skill, not from fear, but from a practical concern about the swiftness of her death. "I have heard say the executioner is very good," she told Kingston, "and I have a little neck." She then laughed, a sound that echoed strangely through the ancient stones of the tower. The French swordsman, whose name history has largely forgotten, was a master of his grim craft. Unlike English executioners, who were often amateurs drawn from the ranks of local butchers or criminals, this man was a professional who had likely trained for years to perfect the technique of judicial beheading. His sword was no crude weapon, but a precisely balanced instrument sharpened to a razor's edge. The method itself was considered more honorable on the continent, reserved for nobility and carried out with ritualistic precision that acknowledged the condemned person's former status. When Anne emerged from her prison in the Tower's bell tower, she walked steadily across the green to where approximately 150 witnesses had gathered. Among them were Thomas Cromwell, who had orchestrated her downfall, and Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had pronounced her marriage to Henry invalid just days before. The scaffold stood only about 4 feet high, designed more for visibility than intimidation. There was no block. Anne would kneel upright, allowing the swordsman to approach from behind. The execution itself was a masterpiece of deadly efficiency. Anne knelt on the scaffold, her ladies carefully arranging her skirts and removing her headdress to reveal her dark hair pinned up and away from her neck. She covered her eyes with a cloth, both for modesty and to spare herself the sight of the approaching blade. The swordsman positioned himself with practiced precision, calculating the exact angle needed to sever cleanly through the vertebrae. Unlike the traditional cry of "Bring me my sword," used to distract condemned prisoners, the French method relied on silent approach. In a single, fluid motion, the sword swept in a perfect arc. The blade passed through skin, muscle, and bone, as if they were silk. Anne's head was severed so cleanly that witnesses later remarked there seemed to be no suffering whatsoever. Her lips were observed to move for several seconds after decapitation, the final electrical impulses of a brain not yet fully dead. Blood flowed from the severed arteries, but the precision of the cut meant there was no grotesque spurting or prolonged agony typical of axe executions. The entire affair, from Anne's emergence onto the scaffold to her death, lasted less than 10 minutes. Her body remained kneeling for a moment before falling forward, while her head was carefully collected and eventually reunited with her corpse. The speed and efficiency of the execution was exactly what Henry had ordered. A quick, clean death that would minimize the spectacle while ensuring the finality of his decision. This calculated mercy revealed the psychological complexity of Henry's relationship with Anne, even in death. He had loved her enough to break with Rome, yet destroyed her with methodical precision. The imported swordsman represented Henry's desire to kill his wife while maintaining the fiction that he was somehow honoring her. It was execution as elaborate performance, brutal in its finality, yet wrapped in the trappings of continental sophistication and royal consideration. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the narrow windows of her cell in the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn made her final preparations. According to contemporary accounts, she had slept fitfully but awakened with an almost supernatural composure that would unnerve even her captors. The woman who had once commanded the attention of an entire kingdom, who had defied the Pope and reshaped the English Church through sheer force of will, now faced her final performance on the most unforgiving stage of all. Tudor chronicler Edward Hall, who witnessed the execution, later wrote that Anne's demeanor that morning was so serene it seemed as though she were preparing for a court masque rather than her own death. This was not the hysteria one might expect from a condemned woman, but something far more disturbing. The calculated grace of someone who understood that her final moments would echo through history. Every gesture, every word would be scrutinized, remembered, and weaponized by her enemies or defenders for generations to come. When the constable of the Tower came to escort her to Tower Green, Anne had already donned a grey damask gown with a white coif that framed her face. Witnesses noted how she carried herself, head high, spine straight, moving with the same regal bearing that had once captivated Henry VIII. But there was something else in her bearing now, something that made hardened guards avert their eyes. It was the terrible dignity of someone who had accepted not just death, but the complete erasure of everything she had fought to build. As Anne emerged into the courtyard, a small crowd had assembled. Unlike the massive public spectacles that typically accompanied royal executions, this gathering was deliberately intimate. Perhaps 1,000 souls, mostly court officials, Tower staff, and select witnesses. Henry VIII had chosen to limit the audience, possibly to maintain the illusion that Anne's death was a regrettable necessity rather than the calculated political assassination it had become. But this smaller stage only amplified the weight of her final words. Standing before the scaffold, Anne surveyed the faces before her. Among them were men who had once sought her favor, women who had served in her household, officials who had bowed before her as queen just days earlier. Some met her gaze, others studied their feet. The French executioner, specially summoned from Calais for his skill with a sword, waited silently to one side, his face professionally impassive. Then Anne began to speak, and her voice carried clearly across the courtyard. "Good Christian people," she started, her words measured and deliberate, "I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die." The calculated precision of these opening words was breathtaking. Even facing death, Anne refused to proclaim her innocence directly, a move that would have been seen as defying the king's justice. Instead, she chose the language that acknowledged the legal proceedings while subtly emphasizing their human origin. She was dying by the law, not by divine justice. What followed was perhaps the most psychologically complex farewell speech in English royal history. "I will not accuse any man," Anne continued, "nor speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die." Here was a woman performing an impossible balancing act, maintaining her dignity without directly challenging the charges that had condemned her, protecting her daughter Elizabeth's precarious position while subtly undermining the very proceedings that had brought her to this scaffold. Witnesses reported that her voice never wavered, but several noted something unsettling in her eyes. Not fear, but a kind of terrible clarity. She understood exactly what was happening to her and why. This was not justice, but political expediency, not divine judgment, but royal convenience. Yet she would not give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you," Anne declared. "For a gentler, nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord." These words have puzzled historians for centuries. Was this mere political theater, protecting her daughter by refusing to criticize the king? Or was there something deeper, a woman acknowledging that the man who was killing her had once genuinely loved her, and she him? The crowd stood in absolute silence as Anne concluded her speech. "And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best, and thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me." With these final words, she transformed her execution from a moment of royal vengeance into something else entirely, a request for posthumous justice from history itself. As Anne removed her headdress and knelt on the scaffold, several witnesses later reported that she continued speaking, but so quietly that only those closest could hear. Some accounts suggest she recited prayers, others that she whispered final thoughts about her daughter Elizabeth. The executioner himself later claimed that her lips continued moving even as she positioned herself for the sword stroke, as though she carried conversations that could not be completed in the world of the living. In those final moments, as Anne Boleyn placed her hands over her eyes and waited for the blade, she had accomplished something remarkable. She had transformed her death from a symbol of royal justice into a question mark that would haunt the Tudor dynasty. Her words, carefully chosen and precisely delivered, would outlive the political circumstances that had killed her, becoming a testament not to guilt or innocence, but to the terrible grace with which a human being could face systematic destruction while refusing to surrender their essential dignity. The news spread through London with the speed of wildfire. By midday on May 19th, 1536, word had reached every corner of the city. The Queen of England was dead, her head severed by a French swordsman's blade. But the reactions that followed revealed a kingdom fractured along lines of loyalty, fear, and political calculation that would define the remainder of Henry's reign. In the immediate aftermath, an eerie silence descended upon the court. Courtiers who had once vied for Anne's favor now spoke her name in whispers, if at all. The Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, long an enemy of Anne Boleyn, wrote to Emperor Charles V with barely concealed satisfaction. The concubine is dead. Yet even Chapuys seemed unsettled by the speed and brutality of Anne's downfall, noting that the manner of proceeding was so extraordinary and the proofs so weak that many are beginning to doubt. Among the nobility who had witnessed her execution, an uncomfortable awareness began to settle. If a queen could be destroyed so completely on such questionable evidence, what safety did any of them possess? The Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle who had presided over her trial, retreated to his estates and would remain conspicuously absent from court for months. The message was unmistakable. Even blood ties offered no protection when the king's will turned murderous. The common people of London displayed a complex mixture of reactions that reflected their own precarious position. Many had never fully accepted Anne as their rightful queen, viewing her as the foreign interloper who had displaced the beloved Catherine of Aragon. Market vendors and tavern keepers spoke of divine justice, claiming that Anne's death was God's punishment for her role in England's break with Rome. Yet underneath this public endorsement of the king's actions lay a deeper unease. The merchant John Stowe would later write that people felt a deep disquiet, as though the very ground beneath their feet had proven unstable. Internationally, the execution sent shockwaves through European courts. The French ambassador, Bertrand de Salignac, wrote to Francis I describing the English court as a place where death walks openly among the living. King Francis himself, who had once entertained Anne at his court during her youth, expressed private horror at Henry's actions. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, while pleased to see his Aunt Catherine of Aragon's rival destroyed, recognized the dangerous precedent Henry had established. In his correspondence, Charles wondered aloud whether any sovereign who could execute a queen on such grounds could ever be trusted in diplomatic relations. The Pope, Paul III, seized upon Anne's execution as evidence of God's judgment upon England's heretical king. Papal letters circulated throughout Catholic Europe, describing Anne's death as divine retribution, yet even these contained an undercurrent of unease about Henry's willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The execution had accomplished Henry's immediate political goal of removing an unwanted wife, but it had also marked him as a ruler whose word could never be considered permanent. Perhaps most tellingly, the reaction among Henry's own counselors revealed the psychological warfare that had become the defining characteristic of Tudor politics. Thomas Cromwell, who had orchestrated much of the case against Anne, found himself in the peculiar position of having succeeded too well. He had demonstrated that accusations could be manufactured and evidence fabricated to destroy anyone. But in doing so, he had also proven that his own position rested on equally fragile foundations. Within 4 years, Cromwell himself would face the scaffold, victim of the same machinery of destruction he had perfected against Anne. The most profound political impact, however, lay in how the execution redefined the very nature of royal marriage in England. Henry had not simply divorced Anne, he had eliminated her entirely, sending an unmistakable message to future queens about the ultimate consequences of failing to meet his expectations. Jane Seymour, who married Henry just 11 days after Anne's execution, would live under the constant awareness that her predecessor's fate awaited any queen who displeased the king. The systematic destruction of Anne Boleyn also marked a crucial evolution in Tudor propaganda. Henry's government had not merely executed a political enemy, they had completely rewritten her identity in the public consciousness. The woman who had once been celebrated as a reformer and patron of humanist learning was now officially remembered as an adulteress and traitor. This manipulation of public memory would become a defining feature of subsequent Tudor political control, demonstrating that the crown possessed the power not just to take lives, but to reshape how those lives were remembered. Among the religious reformers who had once seen Anne as their protector, a profound disillusionment set in. The realization that their movement's success depended entirely on the whims of a king who was willing to execute his own supporters marked a turning point in English Protestant development. No longer could they rely on royal patronage as a stable foundation for reform. They would need to build their movement on more enduring foundations than the favor of princes. The execution of Anne Boleyn thus achieved Henry's immediate objectives, while simultaneously revealing the corrosive effects of absolute power on the fabric of English society. Fear had become the dominant currency of political life, and trust between ruler and ruled, between courtiers, between allies, had been systematically destroyed. The woman whose death had been designed to restore stability had instead demonstrated that in Tudor England, no position was secure, no promise permanent, and no life sacred when it stood between the king and his desires. For centuries, history books described Anne Boleyn as a witch who seduced the king with dark magic, a woman born with 6 fingers and a grotesque goiter that marked her as evil incarnate. These fabrications, repeated so often they became accepted fact, reveal something far more sinister than medieval superstition. They expose a deliberate campaign to strip a murdered queen of her humanity and justify her execution long after the sword had fallen. The myth of Anne's supposed 6th finger emerged not from eyewitness accounts, but from the venomous pen of Nicholas Sander, a Catholic propagandist writing decades after her death. Sander, who never met Anne and wrote from exile, described her as having 6 fingers on her right hand and a projecting tooth that made her appear monstrous. His account, penned in 1585, nearly 50 years after Anne's execution, was designed not to record history but to demonize the woman whose marriage had torn England from the Catholic Church. The truth tells a different story entirely. Contemporary accounts from those who actually knew Anne describe her as elegant and captivating. The Venetian ambassador, who observed her at court, wrote of her black eyes and graceful bearing. Even her enemies at court, who had every motivation to document physical deformities that might support charges of witchcraft, made no mention of extra fingers or hideous deformities. Court artists painted her hands in exquisite detail, showing 5 perfectly formed fingers. Had she possessed a 6th finger, a deformity that would have been seen as a mark of the devil in Tudor England, Henry VIII, obsessed with divine approval for his actions, would never have risked his soul and kingdom to marry her. Yet the myth persisted because it served a crucial purpose. Each repetition of Anne's supposed deformities retroactively justified her destruction. If she was born marked by Satan, then her execution became not judicial murder, but divine justice. The invented 6th finger transformed a political assassination into a holy crusade against evil itself. The witchcraft accusations prove even more revealing in their calculated timing and content. These charges materialized only after Anne's arrest, when Henry's government desperately needed to justify its actions to a skeptical public and hostile foreign powers. Suddenly, courtiers whispered of Anne's supernatural influence over the king, of her ability to bewitch men into adultery, of her unholy power to prevent Henry from producing male heirs. The evidence for these supernatural claims? Anne had allegedly used sortilege, a vague term encompassing everything from love potions to fortune-telling. Her accusers pointed to her reformed religious views, her possession of books critical of the Catholic Church, and her influence over Henry's religious policies as proof of diabolic intervention. In reality, these accusations revealed the sophisticated political maneuvering of Anne's enemies, who understood that charges of witchcraft would not only ensure her death, but permanently taint her memory. Contemporary legal documents from Anne's trial contain no formal charges of witchcraft, yet these rumors circulated widely enough to shape public opinion. This deliberate ambiguity proved masterful. The government could benefit from whispers of supernatural evil without having to prove claims that even Tudor courts would have found difficult to substantiate. Anne's accusers created a shadow trial in the court of public opinion, where evidence mattered less than the repetition of increasingly fantastical claims. The myth of Anne's goiter, a swelling of the neck that would have been interpreted as another devilish mark, follows the same pattern. Sander claimed she possessed a wen under her chin that she concealed with high necklines and elaborate jewels. Yet portraits painted during her lifetime show no such deformity. More tellingly, Henry's obsession with physical perfection, demonstrated by his rejection of Anne of Cleves based partly on her appearance, makes his attraction to a woman with visible physical deformities psychologically implausible. These fabricated physical abnormalities served a deeper purpose than mere character assassination. In Tudor England, physical deformity was interpreted as external evidence of spiritual corruption. By inventing Anne's monstrous appearance, her enemies transformed her from a victim of judicial murder into a creature that deserved destruction. The imaginary sixth finger and goiter became physical proof of her unfitness to be queen, mother to the future ruler of England, and even to live. The persistence of these myths into modern times reveals their psychological power. Even today, novels and films regularly portray Anne with supernatural abilities or hint at her physical strangeness. These modern retellings, while claiming historical authenticity, perpetuate the same character assassination that began on the scaffold at Tower Green. Each repetition of these discredited myths grants posthumous victory to Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII, and the apparatus of Tudor propaganda. Perhaps, most tragically, these fabrications obscure the real Anne Boleyn, an intelligent, educated woman who promoted religious reform, supported emerging English literature, and championed the rights of the poor through charitable works. The invented witch and monster erases the historical figure who patronized scholars, spoke multiple languages, and demonstrated remarkable courage in her final days. Her true legacy, as mother to Elizabeth I and catalyst for England's break from Rome, becomes overshadowed by tales of supernatural seduction and diabolic deformity. The myths surrounding Anne Boleyn represent more than historical inaccuracy. They constitute a systematic attempt to erase her humanity and justify her murder through retrospective demonization. By believing these fabrications, we become unwitting participants in a propaganda campaign that began over 4 centuries ago, granting final victory to those who destroyed not only Anne's life, but attempted to obliterate her very humanity from historical memory.